The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $45, and the loudest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole crowd. Edmund Vance did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked at what he had bought. A tall floor, standing apothecary cabinet standing dead on the gravel at the end of the row. An old druggist's chest to head high cabinet of dark oak. A whole wall of better than 60 tiny drawers in close rows behind a single warped face, each little drawer faded and labeled in a careful hand, near a man's height of casework and brass pulls. Too big for any kitchen and too plain for any parlor. A cabinet the whole county had already written off as a clumsy old drawer wall nobody alive had a use for. That 100 bidders had walked past and waved off as worthless junk too heavy to bother hauling, and that Edmund had just paid $45 to own swollen drawers and warped face and all. It was a bright, clear Saturday morning, the kind of hard light that comes off a gravel lot at the end of summer, at a county estate auction held in the grassy yard beside a weathered red barn on the edge of a small farming town. Edmund was 71 years old, lean and a little stooped through the shoulders from a lifetime of bending over a bench. With a deeply lined face, gone sun-brown and weathered, short white hair under a flat wool cap, white stubble, and pale, steady eyes that did not move fast. His hands were broad and scarred across the knuckles, the fingertips worn smooth, the hands of a man who had spent 50 years cutting and fitting wood other men only ever leaned on. Edmund had worked that trade his whole life, a cabinetmaker and joiner, the one they sent for when a store needed its counters and shelving, built true and built to last, until the shops went to factory fixtures and pressed board, and the old men who could cut a dovetail by hand were quietly let go. The man who laughed was Royce Tunley, who ran the biggest antiques-and-salvage operation in 3 counties, a heavy-set man of about 55 in a loud plum-checked sport coat he wore to be seen in, his face clean-shaven and ruddy, a thick gold ring on one hand and a cigar in the other. $45, Royce said loud so the whole lot could hear it. $45 for a drawer wall old-timer. Look at the size of the thing. 60 little drawers nobody's opened since the druggist died, half of them swollen shut, the face warped so it won't hardly slide, and not one soul under 80 would let it through their front door. It's too tall for a house and too homely for a shop. You can't sell it, you can't move it, and you'll spend more on a truck and 2 strong backs hauling it home than you paid for it. You didn't buy a cabinet, you bought a wall of empty little boxes, and you paid $45 for the privilege of finding somewhere to put it. He coined the name right there, loud enough to carry, the drawer wall, and it stuck for the rest of that month. The crowd laughed because Royce laughed, the way a crowd does. Edmund stood through it without a change in his face, his thumbs hooked in his apron strings, and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world used when it needed something built and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Edmund's are exactly who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Edmund said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What none of them knew, what Royce Tunley could not have known, grinning behind his cigar, was that Edmund had stood in front of that tall cabinet with more than 50 years awake in him, and something older besides. The crowd saw a wall of empty little boxes, Edmund saw the cabinet. He saw the close-grained oak under the grime, the honest dovetails at every drawer corner, the 60 little fronts hung true by a maker who took pride in it. And he saw the case itself, and the case was wrong. He had built cabinets like it. He knew to a quarter-inch how deep a drawer of that face ought to run, and these drawers were short. The case stood a good hand's breadth deeper than any drawer in it reached. There was a dead space behind that whole bank of little drawers, walled off, where nothing was meant to go. He had, as a young man, built the very shelving and the counters and the prescription bench for the druggist's shop this cabinet had come out of, and he knew how that careful old druggist had thought, and what a man who handled dangerous things might want a hollow for that no drawer would ever reach. The rest of them were pricing the oak by how hard it would be to haul. Edmund knew the difference between a cabinet that was only big and a cabinet that was built to hide something, and what Edmund found when he opened that false back that night would change how a whole town remembered a woman it had called a poisoner for 40 years. Edmund had come up hard. He went to work young alongside the cabinet trade, learning the saws and the chisels and the long, patient feel of fitting one piece of wood to another, so close no blade could follow the seam, and across the years made himself into the kind of joiner a shopkeeper called by name when the work had to be right and had to last. His wife Cora had died after a long illness, and they had buried no family of their own. And after Cora was gone, he lived alone in a small house behind his shop with his tools and his quiet. The town had a use for his hands and no use at all for his memory. He knew that. He bid on the cabinet anyway. He bid because he knew it. A case built deeper than its drawers is a question, and a man who had built 1,000 true things could no more walk past a false back for scrap than walk past his own past. The crowd had seen a drawer wall. Edmund had seen the case as it was, the dovetails cut by a proud hand, the runners hung for a druggist's stock, the dead space walled off behind by somebody who wanted what was inside it to keep. If you've made it this far into Edmund's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the rest of the estate first, the implements and the furniture and the boxed lots knocked down to the dealers, while Edmund waited at the end of the row beside the tall cabinet. When the auctioneer finally came to the apothecary cabinet and called for a bid, Royce glanced at it, called out his joke, and not one other hand went up. Edmund raised one finger, and the gavel came down at 45. He paid in cash at the table, signed the slip, and arranged to bring his flatbed and a furniture dolly around at the end of the day, because moving a cabinet near a man's height and built of solid oak was its own afternoon's work, and the auction rules gave a man until dark to haul off what he had bought. The story got around the town before Edmund's flatbed was off the county road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the feed store to ask, grinning, whether he was going to live in his drawer wall or just be buried standing up in it. Pruitt Hale, who ran the hardware counter, said it plainer than the rest, that there was nothing to an old druggist's cabinet but 60 empty drawers and a sore back for whoever was fool enough to move it. Edmund was buying a tin of beeswax and a fresh card of fine sandpaper and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent 50 years learning that a case is either built deep for a reason or it isn't, and the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which one. But Edmund did not open the cabinet up in the daylight. with the dealer's trucks still on the lot and Royce holding court by the auction table. He waited until the place had emptied out, and he had the tall cabinet home, walked up the dolly ramp, and stood square against the wall in the middle of his shop under a single work lamp, and went at it alone that night after the town had gone quiet and the windows up the street had gone dark. The drawers were swollen and the face was warped, and rather than pry the whole front off and ruin it, he worked it slow, eased the little drawers out one by one with a thin blade and a patient hand, waxed the runners, read the dovetails and the depth of each as it came free, the way you open a thing somebody else built careful a long time ago. And when a whole bank of the lower drawers was lined up empty on his bench, he reached his arm into the case past where any drawer had ever gone, and felt his fingertips meet a panel that had no business being there. A smooth oak back set a full hand too shallow, with a faint line of a hidden seam down one side. Down at the diner they were still asking if he had found a use for his 60 drawers yet. Edmund set his lamp close and ran his thumb along the hidden seam the way he would read a joint before he ever set a chisel to it. The cabinet had its own long, sad history, and the town had let it go to junk with never once asking after it. It ran all the way back to the man who had built that false back into it in a fearful hour, the town's old druggist who decades before had kept the only drug counter for 30 miles, and who kept, besides his open shop books, a second private register of every dangerous drug he ever sold, and to whom. There had been a death one winter, a respected man's wife taken slow and wasting in her own bed. And in the talk that came after, the blame had fallen on the woman who nursed her, a quiet town healer who sat up nights with the sick and the dying, accused of poisoning her own patient and shunned for it the rest of her life, her name spat for 40 years as the woman who killed the things she was paid to mend. What none of them ever asked was what becomes of the truth when the one man who could prove it is afraid to and dies with it still hidden. The answer had been sitting on the gravel the whole time, walled up behind 60 little drawers in a $45 cabinet nobody wanted to open. Edmund worked the hidden seam the slow, careful way, found the wooden button that held the false back, and pressed it free, and the panel swung loose on a leather hinge gone stiff with the years, and what he found told him whose cabinet it was before he ever read a word. Set in the hollow behind the panel was a small canvas roll, gone stiff with age, and when Edmund lifted it, the weight of it ran straight up his arm, and he knew it before he loosed the tie. Gold, a heavy little roll of gold coins. Dull and dark with the years, but unmistakable in the lamp, $20 pieces wrapped and tied by a careful hand. He set them on the bench under the lamp and stood very still. Beside the roll lay a tight bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and Edmund worked it free and found a thick roll of old banknotes, gone soft at the folds, paper money of a kind no bank had printed in his lifetime. A quiet fortune saved out a little at a time. The crowd had priced the whole thing as junk by how hard it was to haul. Edmund stood in his shop with a roll of gold and a roll of old notes in his scarred hands, and understood that the drawer wall had been worth a man's life, savings the entire 40 years the town laughed at it. But the gold and the notes were only the start of it. Wedged flat behind them against the true back of the case, where no buyer or scrapper would ever have reached, was a hand-kept ledger in a worn leather cover, and Edmund eased it out and opened it under the lamp, and the back of his neck went cold. It was a druggist's private register, close written in a careful slanting hand, and it was not the open shop book of sugar pills and tonics. It was the other book, the quiet one, the poison register. Every dangerous grain the old druggist had ever sold set down with the date, the dose, and the name of the man or woman who carried it out his door. And there, page after page across one long winter, was a single name signing for the same slow poison again and again. Not the nurse, never once the nurse, but the respected husband himself. The grieving widower the whole town had pitied, buying the very thing that wasted his wife away, dose after dose, signed plain in his own hand. The healer the town had shunned had never bought a grain of it in her life. The register proved it, line by line. On the last pages, the old druggist had written a few quiet lines of his own, that he had sold what was asked and was slow to see the pattern, and slower still to dare name a powerful man a murderer, that by the time he was sure, the wife was buried, and the nurse was ruined, and he was an old man afraid of being the next to sicken. That he had hidden the register where only a careful hand would ever find it, and that whoever found it should carry it to the law and the people who were wronged, because he had not been brave enough in his life and would not rest a coward in the ground. Edmund read it twice through, and the only man in that county who still knew how that old druggist built and thought now held the proof of a wrongly blamed woman's whole innocence in two hands, a fortune saved and hidden, and the honest register of a crime a town had pinned on the wrong soul for 40 years. The next morning, Edmund did not call a single dealer to sell, and did not put the gold up for its melt value, and did not keep one coin of it for himself, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. He had spent one whole month being the man who paid $45 for a drawer wall, and he did not mind being thought a fool by people who had never once been right about the thing in front of them. He carried the poison register first to the County Historical Society and then to the old courthouse clerk who kept the records of that long-ago death, and set himself to the harder things, to clear a dead woman's name 40 years late, and to find what last living kin the healer had left and put the gold's lawful value into their hands. The society's keeper went very still over the register, and said quietly that a complete apothecary cabinet of that age, with a druggist's own poison register and a man's hidden savings still sealed behind its false back, was the kind of thing a county museum waits a lifetime for and almost never finds whole, and that the woman it cleared, who had sat up nights with the dying and been called their killer for her trouble, was no poisoner at all, but the one blameless soul in the whole sorry business. And the healer the register cleared had left kin in the county still, a great niece on a farm 2 valleys over, whose family had carried the shame of the name for 3 generations without ever once believing the worst of her. Edmund went to them that winter with the register open to the husband's signed lines, and watched a gray farm woman read a powerful dead man's name beside the poison her great-aunt had been blamed for, and saw her put a hand flat on the table and go quiet. They had grown up on the story of the nurse who poisoned her patient and the family that had to live it down. The register told them instead that she had been wronged by the very man she nursed for, ruined to cover his crime, and shunned to her grave for a murder she did everything in her power to stop. The great niece asked the old cabinetmaker why he had troubled to come so far and give back what he could have melted and kept. Edmund said only that the old druggist had hidden the truth where nobody could call it stolen, and built the false back with his own hands so it would keep until somebody came who could read the joinery, and that he had nobody of his own to leave a thing to. So he had brought the dead man's honest work, and the dead woman's good name, home to the people they were always meant for. There was one thing more Edmund did before the tall cabinet left his shop, and he did it for the shunned healer and for no one else. He cleaned and waxed the apothecary cabinet the slow, careful way over a week of nights, eased every swollen drawer back to running true, and set the warped face right, not to make a show of it, but because a thing an honest craftsman had built deep and true to guard the truth deserved to stand whole. And he did not load the little drawers with his own screws and bolts and odd brass and use it for a shop cabinet, because using it to hold his odds and ends was the most ordinary thing in the world, the very thing 100 plain cabinets could do, and there was no truth in it. The truth was the savings a frightened man had hidden, and the register he kept honest in the dark, and the name it gave back to a woman the town had buried as a murderer. So on the last night, with the museum's people coming in the morning, Edmund stood the tall cabinet hole against the wall of his shop under the work lamp, the false back swung open and the hollow empty, the register and the banknotes and the roll of gold set careful before it, and looked at it a long quiet while, and then switched off the lamp and let it rest. He had not fitted the drawer wall to hold his own odds and ends. That part was never the point. He had opened it so that the woman the town had shunned, and the druggist who found his courage too late, would be known one time by somebody who finally understood what they were. That winter the apothecary cabinet and the register went where they belonged, into the county historical hall with the healer's name read clear at last in the old courthouse record, and the gold's lawful value and the banknotes went to the healer's last kin the register helped him find 40 years late, exactly as the old druggist's last page asked. Word of it went around the town the same as the laughter had, only quieter. And the people who had called Edmund a fool let the name the drawer wall drop and did not pick it up again. Royce Tunley was not run out of business and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he never bothered to look at, and the next time he held court by the auction table the others did not lean in so far. Edmund never said a word against him. Being right was the whole of what he had wanted, and it had brought a wronged woman's name and a coward's late honest courage back up out of 40 years of being called a poisoner. The museum kept the tall cabinet where the town could see it. They set the great wall of little drawers upright behind a low rail in the front hall under a soft light, the oak-oiled and whole. The false back standing open the way Edmund had left it, the 60 drawers running true again, the healer's name cut at last into a plate at its foot. Agnes Merrill, who nursed the dying A&D, was called their killer, cleared at last, and beside it the open register turned to the husband's signed lines, and a card that told whoever came through that the woman this cabinet cleared had sat up nights with the sick, had bought no poison and harmed no soul, and had been shunned to her grave to cover a powerful man's crime. And on a still evening that next spring, the light going gold through the tall front windows, Edmund Vance drove over to look in on it, and there in the last of the sun stood the apothecary cabinet, whole and lit and seen at last, the open false back catching the light where a stranger's hands had finally reached it. Edmund was 71 years old, a man the auction had laughed at one whole month, and he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad, scarred hand flat on the cool waxed oak and nodded once, the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had said it for him, the way work always did. A craftsman builds a hollow no one will look in, and walls it off with his own hands, and trusts that somebody will come who can read what he hid there, so that being blamed for 40 years can never be the same as having done the thing, and a town rarely knows what was made true in its own old wood until somebody troubles to open the thing they laughed at. So I'll leave it to you. Was Edmund Vance right to give the gold and the banknotes back to the healer's kin and the cabinet to a museum without keeping a single coin? Or was that one decency too far in a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.